He wasn't supposed to make it past the tide. The storm had been chewing on Harlow Cove for 2 days when the pup washed up against the pilings under the old fish pier, tangled in a frayed crab line, his small body wedged where the black water sucked and slapped at the wood. He was maybe 9 weeks old, a German shepherd by the look of him, soaked down to nothing, and by every law of cold and current, he should have been gone before dawn. Within a month, he would turn a grieving town inside out. He didn't learn his name first. He learned the sound a heart makes when it's about to break, and how to answer it. He talked back to the wind. He stood guard over a child who had stopped speaking. He gave a bitter old man his laugh back from wherever the man had buried it. What happened to that half-drowned dog will leave you wiping your eyes, and it'll make you believe that some things still get found. Before we go further, comment the town you're watching from, and if you believe in second chances for the broken, the ones the world wrote off, do us a kindness and subscribe. Silas Brandt walked the beach every morning at first light, not because he wanted to, but because a body that has been ordered around for 30 years keeps marching after the orders stop. He was 56, a retired Navy SEAL with a chest like a doorframe, gone soft at the edges, gray coming in at his temples like frost on a fence, and eyes the flat blue-gray of the water he could not stop staring at. 14 months ago, his wife, Della, had died in their bed upstairs while he held her hand and lied to her about how good the morning looked. The hospice nurse had said it was peaceful. Silas thought peace was a strange word for a thing that takes everything and leaves the husk standing there holding a cold hand. He had buried 2 people in his life that mattered the way breathing matters. Della was the second. The first had 4 legs. Years before, in a country he was not allowed to name out loud, a Belgian Malinois named Atlas had shoved Silas off a path 2 seconds before the path stopped existing. Silas came home. Atlas did not. He'd carried that for a long time the way a man carries a stone in his boot, never quite forgetting, never quite stopping. And then Della got sick, and the stone in his boot turned out to be the small one. So he walked. He didn't pray anymore, though Della had, every night, her lips moving in the dark. He didn't talk to anybody if he could help it. The cove had learned to leave him be, the way a town learns to step around a man who has gone quiet in a particular way. That morning, the storm had blown itself ragged but not gone, and the surf was the color of old nickels. He almost didn't hear it. Under the boom and drag of the water there was a thin, cracked thread of sound, stubborn and furious. The kind of noise a thing makes when it has decided it is not done yet, even though everything else has decided for it. Silas stopped. The discipline in him went still and listening the way it used to before everything went bad. He climbed down the slick rocks to the pilings, and there in the dark slot between the wood and the water was a small, drowned-looking animal, head barely above the foam working its throat. It wasn't barking. It was talking, a rising, falling, broken little run of notes, half whine, half growl, a sound shaped almost like words, almost like an argument, like the pup had grabbed death by the collar and was telling it exactly where it could go. Silas went into the water to his thighs. The cold bit straight to the bone of an old knee that had been complaining for 15 years, and he ignored it, because some part of him that he'd thought was dead had woken all at once and started giving orders. He cut the crab line with the knife he still carried out of habit, freed the small, tangled body, and lifted it against his chest, and the pup, too weak to lift his head, pressed his wet muzzle into the hollow of Silas's throat and made one more sound, low and warm and grieving, that went straight through the man's ribs like something coming home down a long road. "All right," Silas said, the first word he'd spoken aloud in 9 days. "All right, I've got you." He carried him up the beach inside his coat. By the time he reached the truck, the pup had stopped shivering for exactly 1 breath, then started again. And Silas found himself driving with one hand and keeping the other flat against the small chest, feeling the heartbeat, counting it the way he'd once counted a man's pulse in the dark, and willed it to keep. Dr. Naomi Frost ran the only veterinary clinic in Harlow Cove, a woman in her late 30s with quick brown hands, a long dark braid, and the particular calm of someone who has held a lot of dying things and decided to be gentle anyway. She met Silas at the door at 6:40 in the morning because that's the kind of town it was. She worked over the pup for an hour, warmed him, ran fluids under his loose skin, listened to his lungs. "He's a fighter," she said finally. "Dehydrated, hypothermic, half-starved. No fractures. Somebody dumped him, or he got loose and got swept. 8-9 weeks." She paused because the pup had lifted his head off the towel and was watching her work, and as she pressed the stethoscope to him, he made a long, complaining, rolling sound, an editorial, a clear and personal objection. Naomi stopped. "That's not normal." "He's been doing it since I pulled him out," Silas said. She moved the stethoscope and the pup grumbled again, louder, offended, like a man being asked to fill out the same form twice. Naomi laughed, surprised out of her professional flatness. "He's not crying. He's arguing." She looked up at Silas and her eyes went soft and a little careful. "He settles when you talk, you see that? His whole body just dropped a gear when you said his name. He doesn't have a name. He will," she said. Silas didn't answer. Names were the start of belonging to something, and belonging to something was how you got destroyed. He'd belonged to Atlas. He'd belonged to Della. He had no plans to belong to anything ever again. But the pup turned his head, and his amber eyes found Silas's face and held it. And he made a tiny, certain, two-note sound, a sound like a question and an answer married together. And something in Silas that had been clenched shut for 14 months let go a quarter inch. There was a span of dark water between who Silas had been and who he was now, and as he stood there he thought, without deciding to think it, that the small animal was a thing thrown across that gap. Not a bridge that he'd built, a bridge that had simply arrived. "Bridger," he said. It came out before he could stop it. The pup gave one short, definite bark, as if the matter had been settled long before Silas got around to it. Bridger spent his first week in the back room of the clinic, and his second on a folded quilt by Silas's wood stove. The quilt being one of Della's, which Silas had not been able to make himself give away, and had not been able to make himself look at, and which Bridger took to as if it had been left out for exactly him. By the end of that second week, his coat had dried into a sable so dark it was nearly black across the saddle, with tan firing up his legs and a mask coming in around his eyes. One ear stood up like it had something to prove. The other flopped, undecided. His paws were enormous, the paws of a dog who was going to be a problem someday. And he carried them around the house with the grave, lurching dignity of a small, drunk admiral inspecting a ship. And he would not stop talking. He had a sound for the kettle and a different sound for the mailman. He had a long, descending groan that meant his bowl was empty, and the management would be hearing about it. He had a soft, rolling hum he made only when Silas's breathing changed in the night. A sound that started up in the dark before Silas himself knew the dream had come for him. So that Silas would wake with the dog's chin on his chest and the humming going, and the worst of it already eased, like the dog had reached into the nightmare and turned the volume down. Naomi made notes on her clipboard the way doctors do. Responds to tone before command. Distressed by raised voices. Seeks out grief. That was the phrase she wrote, and then crossed out because it sounded crazy, and then wrote again because it was true. The first person besides Naomi to fall was Otis Penhallow, and Otis would have died before admitting it. Otis was 71 and ran the boatyard at the end of the pier, a leather-faced man with a gray walrus mustache, a permanent grievance, and the conviction that everything built after 1974 was junk. He'd lost his wife 11 years back and had filled the hole she left with complaint, which is a thing a lot of men do, because complaint at least keeps the mouth moving. He came up the dock the first time Silas brought the pup down to the water, and he scowled at the small dog the way he scowled at jet skis and tourists and the price of marine paint. "That a dog or a mop somebody drowned," Otis said. Bridger sat down in front of him, looked up, and made a long, gravelly, descending sound, a near-perfect imitation of Otis's own tone of voice, and Otis stopped chewing the toothpick he kept in the corner of his mouth. "He's mocking me," Otis said, outraged. "He does that," Silas said. Otis crouched down. It took him a while, on those knees, and stuck out a hand, and Bridger leaned his whole front end into it, and groaned with the deep full-body satisfaction of a creature being scratched in exactly the correct place. And something happened in Otis's weathered face that Silas hadn't seen there in the 11 years he'd known him. The old man's eyes went bright and wet, and his mouth worked, and then he laughed. A rusty, startled bark of a laugh, like a hinge that hadn't been opened in a long time. He stood up fast and turned away and pretended to study a piling. Salt in the wind, he said, gets in your eyes. But after that, Bridger had a standing invitation at the boatyard, and Otis started keeping a tin of cheap dog biscuits behind the register that he claimed were for any mutt, not that one in particular, and which only ever got fed to that one in particular. Then there was the boy at the hardware store, except he wasn't a boy, he was 24, and his name was Wesley Pruitt, and he'd come home from a deployment with a flinch in his shoulders he couldn't put down. Wesley stocked shelves and made change and smiled too fast and too wide. Whenever anyone got close, the smile of a man trying to convince a room he was fine. The cannery across the harbor blew an air horn at the shift change, a great flat blast, and every time it went off Wesley's whole body jerked like he'd been hit, and he'd grip the edge of the counter and breathe, and pretend he was checking the underside of it for something. Silas knew that flinch. He'd had it himself once, before he'd married a woman patient enough to teach him how to come back into a room. One afternoon Silas was paying for a length of chain with Bridger sitting at his heel, and the cannery horn went off, and Wesley flinched and dropped the roll of receipts, and his face went the gray of a man somewhere else entirely. And before Silas could do a thing, Bridger crossed the floor, sat down directly against Wesley's leg, and pressed one front paw flat onto the top of the young man's foot. Then he started to hum, low, steady, with weight in it, a sound that didn't ask anything and didn't pity anything, that just laid itself down in the space where the fear was and filled it. Wesley looked down. The faraway gray drained out of his face. He crouched, slow, and put both arms around the dog's neck, and he stayed like that a while, and nobody in the store said a word, because the whole town had begun to understand, the way you understand weather, that the dog was doing something none of them had the first idea how to do. How'd he know? Wesley said, his voice gone thick. Silas thought about it. He doesn't know, he said. He just doesn't leave. It was in the 3rd week of October that the letter came, and the letter is where the story turns. It came to the clinic, addressed in careful pencil to the dog from the pier, because by then Bridger had been in the county paper. Naomi's intake photo, a paragraph about the storm. Naomi read it twice and then drove it out to Silas's place at the edge of town and put it in his hand without a word. The envelope had a Harlow Cove return address and a name Silas half knew, Sutton. Inside, in the round, effortful printing of a child, were 9 words and a drawing. My grandma says your dog talks. My dad did too. The drawing was a stick man in a yellow boat and a smaller stick figure on a dock, and a wide blue strip of crayon water between them that the child had pressed so hard the page had nearly torn. It was signed Marin, and underneath, in an adult's tighter hand, Edith Sutton had added, Marin is my granddaughter. She is 8. She has not spoken a word since we lost her father at sea in March. I do not know why I am writing this. I read about your dog and I have run out of other ideas. God forgive me for grasping at a dog. Silas sat at his kitchen table for a long time, with the letter open in front of him, and Bridger's chin resting on his boot. He thought about a man who would not pass anyone in trouble. He thought about Della, who had prayed every night for things she never lived to see. He thought about a little girl with all her words gone, sitting across a strip of crayon water from a father who didn't come back, and how he, Silas, knew exactly what that water felt like, because he had been standing on his own side of it for 14 months. He'd told himself he was done. He'd told himself the dog was a thing that had happened to him, not a thing he had to do something with. He looked down at Bridger. Bridger looked back up and made a small interrogative sound, both ears managing to stand at once for the length of the question. Yeah, Silas said. I know. Edith Sutton was 68 and ran her late son's house on grit and casseroles from the church. Calder Sutton had been a salmon troller, a big laughing man, and the sea had taken him in a March squall and left his daughter sitting at the window every afternoon at the hour his boat used to come back, watching the gray line where the water met the sky, not crying, not speaking, just watching. Marin was small for 8, thin, dark-haired, with her father's exact eyes, and when Silas and Bridger came through the door she didn't look up. Edith hovered, apologizing in advance, twisting a dish towel. She doesn't take to strangers, I should have said. I'm sorry to have dragged you out. I don't know what I was. Silas wasn't listening, and neither was the dog. Bridger had stopped in the middle of the room. His head came up. He looked at the small girl in the window chair, with an attention so total it was almost frightening, and then he crossed the floor. Not bounding, not the clumsy puppy gallop, but slow, deliberate, the way Atlas used to move toward a thing that mattered, and he sat down at Marin's feet and rested his chin on her knee. The girl went rigid. The whole room held still. Edith pressed the dish towel to her mouth. Silas didn't breathe, and Bridger began, very quietly, to talk. Not the groan, not the argument, something Silas had never heard from him before, a soft, rising and falling murmur, a string of small, warm sounds with no edges on them at all. The sound, Silas thought, his throat closing, of a thing telling another thing it was not alone in the dark. Marin's hand came off the arm of the chair. It hung there, trembling. Then it came down, slow as snow, and settled into the fur at the back of the dog's neck. And the little girl, who had not made a sound since March, opened her mouth, and the smallest, dustiest, most disused voice in the world came out of her, cracked from 14 months of silence. No, not 14. That was Silas's number. Hers was 7, and what she said was, "You came back." Edith made a sound and sat down hard in a kitchen chair. Silas turned and looked out the window at the gray line where the water met the sky, because a man does not let an old woman and a small girl see his face come apart. And he stood there until he had it back under command. Behind him, the girl was crying now, the good kind, the kind that has been dammed up too long, and she had both arms around the dog's neck, and Bridger let her, perfectly still, humming low, taking it, the way he had taken Wesley's fear and Otis's grief and Silas's nightmares, like a thing built to carry exactly this and nothing else. It should have been the end of the hard part. It was the start of it. The county learned about Bridger the way the county learned about everything, which was slowly, and then all at once, and from the wrong direction. 2 counties south, a small overwhelmed shelter had a record. A German shepherd, surrendered in late summer, logged in their system as a possible bite risk after a frightened nip during intake, flagged and then, in the chaos of an underfunded place with too many animals, lost track of, presumed transferred, never neutered, never cleared. When Naomi did Bridger's licensing paperwork, the microchip she scanned, the one nobody had thought to check while the dog was busy dying, pinged that old record awake, and the man whose job it was to act on that record was named Dwight Pell. Dwight Pell was 49, the county's animal services supervisor, a thin, gray, careful man who had spent 20 years watching people make emotional decisions about animals and get hurt, and had responded by deciding to feel nothing and follow the procedure, because the procedure, at least, never lied to you. He was not a cruel man. This is the part people always get wrong about the Dwight Pells of the world. He was a frightened man who had built a wall out of rules, and behind that wall he kept a grief of his own that he had never once let out. And the rules said that a dog flagged as a bite risk, unaltered, with an open disposition order from another jurisdiction, was to be impounded pending evaluation, and that evaluation, in a county with one cramped facility and a budget that got smaller every year, very often ended one way. He drove to Harlow Cove himself, because he always did the hard ones himself. He stood on Silas Brandt's porch with a clipboard and a court date and a face he'd practiced in the mirror for exactly this, and he said the words impound, evaluation, disposition. He did not look at the dog sitting in the doorway. He had learned a long time ago not to look at the dog. Silas read the paper. The hearing was in 11 days. If Bridger failed the evaluation, or if the original order stood, the county had the right to seize him, and a bite risk flag with an out-of-county order behind it was, the paper said in its flat gray language, subject to disposition. Silas had been calm at funerals. He had been calm under fire. He was not calm now. Something rose in him so fast and so hot that the old training had to step in and clamp it down. And he stood very still in his doorway, with the dog's flank warm against his leg, and said, in a voice that had made hardened men go quiet, "He pulled a little girl out of 7 months of silence yesterday. He's not a bite risk. He's the opposite of a bite risk. He's the only thing in this town doing any healing at all." "I'm sure he's a good dog, Mr. Brandt," Dwight Pell said, and for 1/2 second something flickered behind the gray, something that wanted to agree before the wall came back up. "The order's not mine. I just carry it out. There's a process. Bring whatever you've got to the hearing." He left. He sat in his county car at the end of the drive longer than he needed to, his hands on the wheel, not driving, and he did not let himself think about why. The 11 days were the longest of Silas's life since the 11 days he'd known Della had left. He didn't sleep. The thing he'd sworn never to do belonged to something. Hand a piece of his shattered heart to a creature that the world could take away in an afternoon. He had done it without noticing, and now here was the bill, right on schedule, exactly as he'd always known it would come. But here is the thing about a town that has watched a half-drowned dog talk a grieving girl back to life. It does not sit on its hands. Otis Penhallow, who had not been to a public meeting since they'd put the parking meters in, wrote out a statement in pencil on the back of an invoice, 4 crossed-out tries, finally just, "This dog gave me back something I lost. I'm 71. I don't have a lot of those left." He showed up to the boatyard the next morning having shaved, which nobody had ever seen. Wesley Pruitt, who could not stand to be the center of a room, told his story to Naomi so she could read it into the record, because he wasn't sure his own voice would hold, and then on the morning of the hearing he showed up anyway and stood at the back with his shoulders square, and when the cannery horn went off across the water and his body jerked, he kept standing. And Bridger, on a leash at Silas's side, looked over at him and gave one soft hum, and Wesley breathed and stayed. Naomi Frost brought her file, the behavioral notes, the photographs, 12 weeks of documentation on a dog whose entire pathology was that he sought out human pain and sat down inside it, and Edith Sutton brought Marin. The hearing was held in the county building, in a low-ceilinged room with bad fluorescent light and metal chairs, the kind of room where, Silas thought, kindness goes to get processed into paperwork. Dwight Pell sat at the front with his file squared to the table edge. He had the disposition order. He had the law. He read it out in his flat gray voice, and every word of it was true, and every word of it was a small cruelty. And the worst part was that he knew it, and you could see him knowing it, and you could see the wall holding. Silas spoke. He was not a man who spoke. He stood up and he told them about a storm, and a sound under a pier, and a dog that should not have lived, and he found, to his own surprise, that he could not keep Della out of it, or Atlas, that the words came up out of all of it together. "I came home from 2 wars, he said, his voice rough, "and I lost my wife in my own bed, and I had decided I was done. I'd decided the smart thing was to stop loving anything that could die. And then a dog half my arm's length long drowning decided he wasn't done, and dragged me back across to the side of the living, whether I wanted to come or not." He looked at the gray man with the file. "You can call that a bite risk if you want. I'd call it the opposite. I'd call it a working dog who finally found his job." Dwight Pell did not look up from his file. "The order," he said quietly, "is for a documented bite incident and a missed disposition. I'm sorry, Mr. Brandt. Feelings aren't." And that was when the air horn at the cannery went off, flat and huge, rolling across us the water and straight through the thin walls of the county building. Marin had been sitting very still in the metal chair beside her grandmother, both hands knotted in her lap, her eyes too big in her small white face. The room, the strangers, the gray man saying gray words about her dog. It had all been building in her. Silas had seen it, the way you see a wave stand up before it breaks. The horn was the last thing. Her eyes went glassy and fixed on nothing, on the gray line only she could see, where a yellow boat had gone out one March morning and not come back, and her breath came in fast, shallow gulps, and Edith said her name and got nothing, because the girl was not in the room anymore. She was at the window. She was on the dock. She was on her side of the water and going under. Bridger came off the floor like the years had never happened to him. The leash slipped Silas's hand. The dog crossed the room, past the metal chairs, past the gray man, past the law and the order, and the file squared to the edge of the table, and he reached the small girl, and he put his front paws up on her knees and pressed his big dark head straight into the center of her chest, against the place where her heart was hammering, and he held it there, and he began to murmur, that soft, seamless rising-falling sound, the "I'm here," the "you're not alone," the only language he had ever truly spoken, and the room went silent except for the dog. Marin's gulping breath caught. Her glassy eyes blinked, found the dark fur an inch from her face focused. Her knotted hands came open. They sank into his ruff, and she bent down over him and put her face against the top of his head, and the whole room watched an 8-year-old girl come back across the water one more time. hauled in by a dog who had taught himself to do nothing in this world but refuse to leave. Silas looked at Dwight Pell, and Dwight Pell was not looking at his file anymore. He was looking at the dog and the girl, and the wall he had spent 20 years building was coming down in his gray face, one course of bricks at a time, and behind it was the thing he'd kept back there all along. A daughter of his own, Silas would learn later, lost to an illness when she was 7, and a man who had decided after that to follow procedures, because procedures could not be taken from you in a hospital hallway at 3 in the morning. He had spent 2 decades not looking at the dog. He looked now. His jaw worked. His hand, on top of the disposition order, slowly flattened, and then slid the order an inch away from himself across the table, as if it had become something he no longer wanted to be touching. "Dr. Frost," he said, and his flat voice had a crack down the middle of it now, "your facility's licensed for behavioral evaluation. I'm going to enter a finding that this animal is a working therapy candidate and reassign the disposition for reevaluation under that classification." He closed his eyes for 1 second. "The bite flag is, there's discretion. I'm exercising it." He gathered his file with hands that were not entirely steady, and he stood, and at the door he stopped, and without turning around he said, to the room, to the girl, to the dog, maybe to a daughter 20 years gone, "Take good care of him." Then he went out fast, and Silas, who knew exactly what that walk looked like, let him go and did not follow, because some men have to put themselves back together where nobody can see. Bridger stayed in Harlow Cove. The arrangement that grew up around him was the kind that only grows in small places. Half Silas's dog and half Marin's, a creature who slept most nights on Della's quilt by Silas's stove and spent most afternoons in the Sutton kitchen, who walked the pier with an old man who pretended not to like him and rode shotgun in a young veteran's truck to the VA an hour up the coast and sat in the waiting room being leaned on. Naomi got a grant. There came to be a word for what Bridger did, an official word with a billing code, but nobody in town used it. They just said the dog was working, and Silas, who had decided to stop loving anything that could die, found that he had lost that argument completely and didn't mind. He started talking again, to Otis, to Wesley, to Edith over coffee, to the dog most of all, long rambling one-sided conversations that Bridger answered with grumbles and groans and the occasional editorial bark. One evening, going through the cedar chest for a blanket, his hand closed on the small box with Della's rings in it, and he sat down on the bedroom floor and opened it, and Bridger came and pressed his chin onto Silas's thigh, against the place where his hand was shaking, and hummed. Silas had thought, for 14 months, that he would carry that grief like a stone in his boot until he died. He sat on the floor in the lamplight and understood, finally, that Della had not loved him so that he could spend the rest of his life standing guard over the ashes of her. He kissed the box once and put it back, not buried, just laid down gentle. "Not yet, sweetheart," he said, "but not like this anymore either." A year later, near the end of another October, the church bell down on Harlow Street rang out across the cove on a clear cold morning, and a strong young shepherd with a deep black saddle, and his father's enormous paws grown into at last, lifted his head from the front porch of the Sutton house, where a girl who could not stop talking now was lacing up her boots, and he sang, not to a horn, not to fear, not to the gray line where the water meets the sky. To the bell, to the cold, to the whole loud living world that had nearly let him drown, and then, through one stubborn refusal after another, had not. Silas stood at the gate in his old coat and watched. Otis was on the porch steps complaining about something with a biscuit tin in his lap. Wesley was throwing a tennis ball that the dog had no intention of returning. Edith was in the doorway with her hand on Marin's shoulder, and the two of them were laughing at something the dog had done. Silas reached into his pocket and took out Atlas's old tag, the one he'd carried in every pocket he'd owned for 15 years, and he knelt down at the gate post and wrapped the chain twice around the rail and fastened it there, so it caught the gray light, so it would stay. He'd thought he would keep it forever. He understood now that keeping a thing and letting it work are two different acts of love, and that he had spent far too long confusing the first for the second. "You brought me home too," he said, and he wasn't entirely sure whether he meant Atlas or Della or the half-drowned dog now singing at the cold, or all of them at once. The whole company of the loved and the lost who turn out, in the end, to have been pulling you back across the water the whole time. Bridger came off the porch and ran to him and leaned his full weight into the man's legs, the way he'd done that first day in the clinic. And he gave one bright bark that made Marin laugh out loud, and Silas Brandt, who had walked an empty beach every morning for 14 months, because his body kept marching after the orders stopped, put his hand on the dog's head and let himself at last be glad. The miracles that mend a life rarely come down out of the sky with trumpets. More often they come in soaked and shivering and half dead, tangled in a crab line under a pier, making a stubborn small noise that says, "I am not finished." They come as a dog nobody wanted, a child's first word in 7 months, an old man's rusty laugh, a frightened official sliding one piece of paper an inch away from himself. We are not all of us going to pull a drowning shepherd out of the surf, but every one of us, today, walks past someone standing on their own gray edge of the water, not speaking, watching the place where the thing they lost went under. A word, a casserole, a phone call, a refusal to leave. It costs almost nothing, and it might be the rope that hauls a whole life back to shore. If this story reached something in you, share it with somebody who needs to be reminded that the broken still get found. Tell us your favorite moment, comment the town you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, second chances, and the quiet four-legged grace of God. Bless your home, and the ones you've lost, and the ones still here to be loved. Amen.